actually a cooperation between the state and private sector, like the government, but was funded as well by World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, where the promises were high at that time. But the book will actually touch upon the gap between the promises, the expectations, and the actual outcome of the project, especially on the livelihoods of the people who used to live on the Nagai Plateau, the effects on their lives, the environmental impacts, of course, socio-cultural impact as well. So we have Bruce with us now, and he'll get 20 minutes for this and then 15 minutes each for other speakers. So let me introduce Bruce first and get 20 minutes because he's one of the co-editors as well. So he'll be providing the overview of the book. Bruce is a board member of its Inclusive Development International and an independent researcher on natural resource conflict issues with a focus on the Mekong region. He lived in Laos for 8 years, so first had a lot of hands-on experiences there in the 90s, and then worked for more than 10 years with the Southeast Asia Grants Program of the McKnight Foundation. Has written extensively about issues of real-based livelihoods, resettlement and related issues, and have been following the project, the Mountain 2 project, since the days of its early planning. So, please, Bruce.
Thank you. Thank you. Maybe I should sit there with him. It's great to have, great to be here, and also happy to have some of my fellow contributors. This was very much a collaborative book. We have actually contributions from 17 different people in it. And my co-editor, Bill Robichaud, unfortunately can't be here today. He's just getting to Bangkok, and he's going to be around, but had to miss this. And so we have, among the contributors, of people that have worked for the project as consultants to the World Bank or worked for the NGOs that contracted. Also people that have been sort of long-time monitors and critics of the project. And so it's a project that, for me, I've definitely been following. Actually, in the book we talk about my first meeting I was at on Mountain 2 was in 1991, that long ago, when it was just first being proposed by the Snowy Mountain Engineering Company, an Australian engineering company. And then in the mid-90s, it was the big thing in Vientiane for the NGO community there for a while. It was became very controversial among, I think because there was a big split among NGOs on whether to engage with it or not. Some NGOs actually took contracts and got, in one case even formally endorsed the project. And then there was also a lot of NGOs getting sort of dragged into the consultation process and kind of questioning whether they should really be doing that or not. So, and then in 2001, I worked on a river study of the Sabungai river-based livelihoods to sort of do some baseline data independently of the bank's planning process. So, Mountain 2 actually came out of a new idea for a hydropower project and for a new model, and the roots were in the big controversies that affected large-scale hydropower from the 1960s and 70s, when it was increasingly controversial and became associated with human rights violations, resettlement. And that was true nowhere more than Thailand, where the World Bank's last big hydropower project it funded in the early 1990s, Bak Moon, became a real center of controversy for villagers, and actually really spawned a large protest movement among Thai villagers who lost their livelihoods because of the damages to fisheries. So we had a move towards Laos. EGAT, the Electrical Generating Authority of Thailand, actually told one of my colleagues there that they specifically went to Laos because there would not be opposition there. That's not, so there's not so much on the, not too many on the record statements, but very much, I think Thai financiers saw it as much easier to build hydropower in Laos that could then, where the power could then be exported to Thailand. And the World Bank and the international financial community liked the idea of supporting hydropower in Laos as well. It fit with their mandate as supporting least development countries. There's big hydropower potential, and as Laos was emerging from a more doctrinaire communist economy, it was a potential, to bring in private sector investment, which was a strong priority of the banks. I first watched Nam Ton 2 being developed in the 1990s and going through a whole bunch of delays, and the bank being very cautious because there'd been so much criticism of hydropower, they really wanted to do it right. And that ran up to the point of the Southeast Asia financial crisis that began in 1997, and by 1998, the regional economy was in a real meltdown here. So that delayed, and for a while people thought it might just stop the Nam Ton 2. It stopped a lot of other hydropower projects, like Sapien Saint Noi, for a period of time. And then this World Commission on Dams process was taking place in the late 90s, in which the bank had agreed to sit down with a lot of their critics and have a process of examining why hydropower had been so controversial. And that process ended up really affirming a lot of the criticisms that civil society had of large hydro. It was scathingly critical of the World Bank's Bak Moon project, and concluded that major reforms were needed for how communities were consulted with and involved in hydropower projects. So the bank knew they had to do something really different if they were going to credibly propose a new hydropower model in Laos. And one thing they did was, everybody acknowledged there was a lack of local civil society in Laos, and so trying to have your new model project in Laos was very challenging because you didn't have local institutions to consult with and engage with. And one of the things the bank did was bring in international experts and formed a panel of environmental and social experts to advise and actually endorse or not the project. And the POE, as they were known, became very influential in first rapidly just becoming in favor of the project after only a short time in Laos, and then advising on it and doing public reports for more than the next 20 years. The last one just got released a few weeks ago. But they endorsed the project back in '97 and were really strong project supporters for many years. Another thing was that as I mentioned earlier, international NGOs got involved in the project, and especially in the conservation program, which was an important part of kind of rebranding Nam Ton 2 as a green, environmentally friendly project that would have a lot of benefits for the surrounding protected area. That's the Nagai Nam Ton protected area. And then there was just this thought that Thailand was going to have this ever rapidly increasing demand for electricity, which actually didn't turn out to be true ever since the financial crisis. EGAT's projections of Thai electricity needs have been greatly inflated, and the country's maintained a large reserve of power, which means even though Nam Ton 2 power is used and it's not expensive, but the country easily could have done without it if it hadn't gone through. So just real quickly, a few of the main elements. Largest hydropower project at the time, $1.3 billion, all going to export 95% plus to Thailand, with the idea that the revenues would go to to alleviate poverty in Laos. Done as the first large public-private partnership between the government through the Nam Thun 2 Power Company, which is Electricity de France, the private sector arm of ECO, and then the Lao government. So the bank and the ADB provided political risk guarantees rather than being direct financiers of the project. They provided risk guarantee basically to ensure that the investors in the project that they wouldn't lose their investment due to policy changes that the Lao government might make. And so build, own, operate, transfer, 25-year concession. The private company is responsible for social and environmental mitigation, but with limits, especially on the downstream program. But they did agree that $1 million a year would go to this Watershed Management and Protection Authority to work on conservation in the protected area. The idea being that you'd sacrifice the reservoir area, which had a lot of biodiversity, but that would provide the income needed to protect the upper watershed. So after it was revived in the early 2000s, there was a big campaign by NGOs, and then it was approved in 2005 and started generating electricity in 2010. It's a trans-basin diversion, which is very interesting. It actually moves water from one river system, the Nam Thun, to the Sebong Phai. It's an engineer's dream because you just build a 50-meter high dam, but you get a drop of water of 350 meters because the water is backed up and goes through a tunnel over the escarpment and down into the Sebong Phai River. So it creates a huge amount of power. It's very economical. But that means that it has big impacts on two river systems, both the Nam Thun, which loses water, and then the Sebong Phai, which has its dry season water level more than doubled. So there's for a model project, I like to think, and there's actually a term in Lao about Lim Tanoi Kanyai, where you should start small and do something larger after you get a track record. But the bank started out with this huge project as their new model project, and so it has very severe potential impacts and risks for people. A large reservoir on the Nagai Plateau, where you had over 6,000 indigenous ethnic minority communities who lived there and had their livelihoods based on the plateau. Many more people in the downstream areas. We found well over 100,000 close to with livelihood links to the Sebong Phai River, and you could see the fisheries there as being super important. When we visited in 2001, there was fish markets everywhere and lots of traders coming to get fish from Takek and even from Thailand. And then, of course, there's the concern about the upper watershed, which is one of the most important nature preserves in all of Southeast Asian, the Nagai Nam Thun protected area. Most famously, home of the Sawa, the most recently discovered to science large mammal, which was only described in the early 1990s, and lots of other really important conservation values there, going right up to the Vietnam border. So we had a number of really important social and environmental issues at stake, and the bank have assured a lot of skeptical people at the time that they could overcome all these obstacles through their this new model where you have benefits flowing to the protected area, involvement of NGOs, lots of international monitoring, and the revenues would be in the concession agreement, the company would agree to improve and restore the lives of the resettlers and the and then you have the revenues going for national level poverty alleviation. It was the World Bank was so confident and proud of this model that they actually wrote a book about Mountain 2, which our book, in a way, I guess, is a critical response to this, although I think it's not just based on refuting doing a dam better. It's kind of a more wide-ranging book, but doing a dam better, which was originally going to be titled "Doing a Dam Right," and they backed out off at the last minute and just decided maybe doing a dam better was ambitious enough. But anyway, this was followed by a large public relations campaign in which the bank kind of countered its critics and had really made Mountain 2 a focus of talking about how they had a really positive new model. And then by 2012, 2013, where the bank was even making statements that the success of Mountain 2 had provided justification for the bank to re-engage in large hydropower worldwide. But kind of a funny thing happened, and the panel of experts for the project, which had been so supportive and endorsing of the project during its planning and construction, started to become more and more critical of the project and how both the social and environmental programs were being implemented. For a researcher, the panel of experts reports are really fascinating because it's a very detailed documentation year by year, one or two really detailed reports about the status of the project, that both the conservation work, really focused on the resettlers, and then to some degree the Save on Fi downstream program. So this increasing concern of the panel of experts culminated with Dr. Scudder, a leading member and international expert on resettlement, kind of formally renouncing Mountain 2 and saying it had been a mistake. He called it his final disappointment. This was in his early 80s, after a long career where he'd been trying to make hydropower projects work better for people and had often been very critical of them and thought that in Mountain 2 he finally had a positive model. But it wasn't just Dr. Scudder. The whole panel had developed really serious criticisms, and if you read their reports from 2013, 14, 15, every report they're getting more and more concerned about how poorly these programs are being implemented. And I'm happy that I've got some colleagues here who are going to talk about some of that work in detail. I'll just, unfortunately, Bill Robichaud is not here to talk about the conservation work, but what we found is that, our own research, I personally concentrated mostly on the Save on Fi and downstream impacts, but what people working in the conservation area found is a real failure to achieve these ambitious goals that had been set out for the project. And that has had big reverberations kind of through the funding, the reality of funding these projects. We had beyond the impacts at the local level, where there were supposed to be these positive social and environmental impacts, there was also just the issue of where the money goes. The Lao government, through a subsidiary, has a 25% stake in the project, and one of the ideas was that this money would go, these revenues would flow to the Lao government and then go to support poverty alleviation projects. But the bank never set up a separate fund for the funds to go into, so they got mingled in with Lao government funds. And it's been, for years, the World Bank reports called Nam Tintu moderately unsatisfactory, their ISR reports, and a lot of it related to inability to really track what was happening with the money. Now, as the World Bank's got closer to exiting the project, they've, I think, tried to put a pretty good face on it, but it's very hard. There's very little documentation over how these revenues are being used. And we're also seeing one of the big rationales was that the bank, or that the Lao government would take all these revenues and be able to become less dependent on foreign aid. And one of the main things was the Poverty Reduction Fund, which was set up by the bank at the same time as Nam Tintu. The idea being that Nam Tintu revenues could then keep this Poverty Reduction Fund going, but just this last year they had a refinancing of the Poverty Reduction Fund, and just a tiny percentage of the money's coming from the Lao government. It's still remaining a foreign donor-funded program. So we just have not seen evidence that the funds are really going towards poverty alleviation. And this is something that I think the bank really had an obligation to do, because in that this project is mainly for export of electricity, it's particularly important that you can demonstrate widespread benefits for the people as a whole. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, Bill can't be here to talk about what's happened in the conservation areas, but it's been a huge failure there has just not been an ability to protect the biodiversity. And part of this relates to the problems with the resettlement program, where villagers, having a lack of other income, themselves went into the protected area and did a lot of rosewood and wildlife poaching. But it's also been the authority set up with this $1 million a year has been completely ineffective in stopping wildlife poaching from the Vietnam side and from the Laos side. So that's all being just restructured right now, and there's some hope that they can get it back on track. But in the meantime, there's been a huge amount of loss of wildlife and biodiversity, and we can go into that more. But that is where I'm going to go for now, and then have my colleague Glenn Hunt, who has looked at the livelihoods program for the people that were settled from Nagai, go on, and then Carl is going to talk about some of the legacies of the project, and our colleague Kanakwan, who has also worked on the project, she's arriving a little bit late, but she's going to talk some about the downstream impacts and focus on women and indigenous people. So I'm going to leave it there and turn it over to Glenn. Thank you.
Just introduce Glenn a bit. So Glenn is the lead author of Chapter 5, Broken Pillars, the Failure of the Nakai Plateau Livelihood Resettlement Program. He's now a PhD candidate at the University of Bern, Switzerland, currently living and working on international development in Yankon, Myanmar. So he was involved in land and forest issues for international NGOs from 2004 to 2013, and from 2004 to 2009, he was involved in actively monitoring the Nam Tintu resettlement program as well. So a lot of the field work in the resettlement communities would give the insights whether the restored livelihood programs of the power company actually bore some results. And he has some personal engagement with the formal stakeholder consultation process as well. So thanks for that.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me and for asking me to author the livelihoods chapter, Bruce. As was just said, I've been monitoring this project for some time. Just because I happen to be in the right place at the right time, or perhaps the wrong place at the right time. I was working for a small international NGO up on the Nakai Plateau. There was a target village we had up on the Nakai Plateau in 2004, and this was very much at the stage, and there was a lot of talk about the Namtatu Dam, whether it was going ahead or not. And so I found myself in the middle of a global controversy. Bruce talked about the WCD and everything, and I started to get involved more and more in this, not having a background on hydropower. I don't work on hydropower, but found myself in the middle of all this, and I guess this presentation is part of a long history looking at this project. In 2005, I was actually asked by International Rivers to review the social development plan, and partly the reason why I authored this book is because my knowledge of the social development plan was quite extensive, and so I knew from 2005 what was planned, and then through reading all these panel of experts reports, doing my own monitoring missions, working with Mekong Watch, and going up to the Naika Plateau independently, kept in touch with the project and was able to follow, I guess, the outcomes of this plan. So I want to talk a little bit about these pillars of livelihood restoration. Of course, it's very easy in resettled communities to build the infrastructure, to build the housing, to move everybody physically is not a problem. And if anybody's seen promotional material, you'll see brand new sparkling houses with tin roofs, people living wonderful lives. But the problem really with these sorts of projects, and this really came out of the WCD, was that how do you replace people's livelihoods? And so the Namtatu Dam had a 5 or 4 volume social development plan, which was the plan for the entire dam. And volume 2, which was about this thick, over 1,000 pages, really reviewed or came up with a bunch of solutions for people on the Nakai Plateau to adapt their livelihoods and change and to create sustainable livelihoods going forward. And so these were evolved around community forestry, around fisheries, around agriculture, livestock, and then off-farm. And so it's very difficult, I guess, in 15 minutes to try and present a comprehensive analysis of everything that has gone wrong with this resettlement plan. So forgive me for being very brief, but I'm just going to go through pillar by pillar and give a very brief summary of what the plans were and sort of how it ended up. So this is the resettlement area, and you'll see the reservoir is this is a 430 square kilometer reservoir, and you'll see the little red lines and the black dots moving to the little village areas. So this is the resettlement process. So villages move from these black dot areas into the new resettlement communities along the southern shore. And then, maybe you can't see it very well, but don't have a pointer. Basically around the south or the sort of western edge of the reservoir, you see this community forestry area. And so the idea was there was supposed to be this community forestry system set up in these areas to the sort of south of all the resettlement areas. So this is basically how the resettlement program looked up on the Nakai Plateau. And I just want to introduce you briefly to the village where we were working in 2004-2005. This was Nakai Nua, so it was one of the more wealthy villages in the area. So perhaps it isn't a cross-representative sample of the extent of all the villages. It was particularly unusual. It had a lot of paddy fields. I think there were 3 villages along the sort of southern shoreline that had extensive paddy fields. There was a lot of buffalo raising, community forestry. Yes, people were sort of didn't have a high level of income, but they did have a level of food security. We were undertaking a community forestry project there to try and provide some tenure security over community forest areas, and it was a real sort of efficient system in terms of they had paddy fields in the wet season, the buffalo grazed across those paddy fields in the dry season. People collected NTFPs, what they got for their livelihoods they got sort of from the forest. They had decent houses and so forth. We were supporting with water and sanitation work. it was a poor village, but it was also quite sustainable in terms of livelihoods. So this is how the village looked in 2004. So I just wanted to show you this so you can get an idea of like how people's livelihoods were composed before resettlement. So in looking at the first of these pillars, it's the forestry pillar. So basically the plan with this forestry pillar, like this was supposed to be really the pinnacle of the livelihood incomes, and like a full third of income supposed to come from this. The idea was that there was going to be sustainable logging of the village forest areas, establishment of this village forest association, the VFA, and that would be sort of managed with international expertise, and that the VFA would have the exclusive rights to harvest the timber from this 25,000 hectare community forestry area. What happened, of course, was very, very different, and really, like, a lot of this information is coming out of the panel of experts report, of which there's 28 different reports. And if there's one thing I would say is been really helpful in allowing civil society to monitor this project, it has been that panel of experts reports. They've been very frank at times and really delved into a lot of these problems that otherwise people would have a very hard time finding out. And I think this really shows, like, with this level of scrutiny, the extent to which these problems exist. And it's very unfortunate that the more the private sector gets involved in these hydropower projects, the less that these sort of impacts are clearly seen. But in the forestry pillar, the POE summed it up brilliantly in their most recent report, which said that the forestry pillar was an experiment which has failed the resettlers. So instead of having communities having exclusive rights to log these areas, influential companies remained on the plateau and were engaged in ongoing logging operations, commercial extraction. They maintained sawmills up on the Nakai Plateau. So there was no incentive, or there was no political will, I guess, from the government of Laos to really remove those groups and to stop them from extracting all that valuable timber. Additionally, the government taxed the income and the revenue from these logging operations up to 42%. So there was high taxes taken off the top of this, and that resulted in dividends not really being paid to villagers. And so the latest panel of experts report says that in the last 4 years there's been no dividend payment. So that the idea was that every year there should be regular dividend payments coming to communities, and that just failed to happen. And I mean, the chapter in the book really goes into this idea of community forestry in Laos, and it's something that has never worked in Laos, and the government of Laos isn't really prepared to allow this sort of community-based logging operations. And in fact, there's a great quote in the book where an expert, as early as I think 2000, talks to one of the authors and says, that the government of Laos said there's no way that villages are going to be able to log these forests. So this was a clear risk to this entire process well before the project got underway, and it very much turned out that the forestry pillar has completely failed to provide any sort of revenue to villages. And finally, what's happened at the end of all this is that the communities have basically resigned themselves to the fact that they're not going to be able to get any revenue out of the community logging operations. The entire VFA is to be disbanded, and that communities are basically saying, look, we just want to be able to secure non-timber forest products, we want to have our mushrooms that we can eat, and we want to be able to have some timber to build houses in the future. So for goodness sake, just let us control our forests and everybody get the hell out. And that's pretty much how it's all ended. It's been a pretty sad story tale. And for one of the pillars that was really supposed to be the primary source of income, it's been an unmitigated disaster. For the fisheries pillar, I've borrowed this photograph that Bruce had in his presentation, because I just wanted to highlight this issue of biomass clearance. For fisheries on the reservoir, in the very early stages of the social development plan, like biomass clearance, that is clearing all the undergrowth, the trees, all that vegetation was of vital importance to sustain healthy fisheries on the reservoir. because if you don't clear that biomass clearance, all that rotting vegetation basically sucks the oxygen out of the water and you get these dead zones. And it's hard from photographs when you're on the ground to really appreciate how the company has utterly failed to engage in this biomass clearance. But this is a really good example of the extent of tree cover and subsequently shrub cover that existed in the reservoir when it was flooded. And so this has really created a lot of deoxygenated dead zones. And although the fisheries pillar is said to be one of the most successful, and it's something that now a lot of villages are relying on for their income, it could have been so much better if the recommendations of the social development plan were actually followed at the beginning. Of course, the reasons why they weren't followed are very typical, in that the contractors who were hired to clear the biomass only wanted to clear the valuable timber species, and it wasn't economically viable for them to go and clear the rest of the undergrowth. And so right up until the day of empowerment, the panel of experts was really forcing the government to ensure that this biomass clearance was undertaken. As you can see, it clearly was not, at least not through the whole reservoir of 430 square kilometres, so it's a huge task to try and do that. But essentially that's resulted in a lot of dead zones. The plan was to have exclusive fishing rights for communities, avoid the introduction of invasive species, and then to create this complicated village fishing type of authority. So the results, as I said, the biomass largely was uncleared. Within the first year, invasive species were introduced, and as part of the chapter, I reviewed some reports that were put out by NTPC, and they were talking about how devastating these sorts of tilapia and carp species are to other species in the reservoir. Although a 20-year exclusive fishing rights have been given to the communities under presidential decree, it's very difficult to enforce that. There's a lot of reference in the panel of experts reports to people coming in and fishing those places, and that's very much in line with the reality of the situation in Laos, in that fisheries are open, anyone can come in and take it. So it's been very hard for the government to try and stop that. So I just wanted to quickly show you here. This is taken from one of the NTPC scientific reports. It shows, the top graph shows the oxygenated levels at a monitoring station called Res 1, which is up in the north of the dam site, where there was almost no biomass clearance undertaken, and then on the other one is monitoring station 9, Res 9, where there was a lot of clearance undertaken. So you can see the difference. This is going to sort of 2013 only, and that's all the data we have. But you can see the levels of change in water quality. Red being 0 oxygen levels, and blue being high oxygen levels. So the biomass clearance is really, really important to fisheries, and the fact that that wasn't undertaken has a very detrimental effect. The agricultural pillar the idea was to have 0.66 hectares of farms per family, including 0.16 hectares of paddy. There should be irrigation pumps. A pilot village was established very early on in the project to sort of try and demonstrate that this could work and was sustainable. And that the idea was that these farms would be set up very early in the process, so that the communities could start selling produce to the construction team, so that there would be a ready market to take in this produce. Also, hidden in the footnotes of an appendix inside the social development plan, there was an indication of just how poor the soil quality was, and it essentially sort of highlighted just the total impracticability of actually the entire agricultural pillar very, very early on. And this is something we wrote in the International Rivers review, was that it required per hectare 2 to 5 tons of lime to be put on each farm over the first 3 years, and thereafter 50 kilograms per hectare per year of inorganic fertilizer just to keep those soils maintained. So in a way, this I thought was very deceitful because it wasn't something that was openly talked about in the report itself. It was only when you looked at the footnote and then when searching in the annexes that you could find this sort of information. It's one of these things where, really what was the purpose of this social development plan? Was it to present this fantasy reality of, where, okay, if you had this and this and this and this, it might work? Or was it really to create a livelihood scenario in villages? And this sort of, statistic and data saying you need 2 to 5 tons per hectare of lime to be put on these farmlands really just indicates that it was completely impractical to have this agricultural pillar to ever be a success. And of course it wasn't. Of course the company themselves didn't do any service to the villagers by delaying the resettlement process until impoundment was taking place in 2008. And I remember going back to Nakainua in 2008 in April and June. And just, people were pulling down their own houses and moving everything. And so those farms never got started. And another thing which, when I was traveling with Miko, which we found out is that the pilot village, Nongbua, people were actually being employed by the company. So it looked very sustainable. Everybody was happy because they were all getting salaries. And so the farmers were getting salaries from the pilot demonstration farm. It was only 30 families, so it was very easy for the company to hire them. That was never stated, and actually in POE report 26, that Nongbua villages subsequently became one of the worst performing villages in terms of resettlement livelihoods, partly because they were living on this teat of employment and salaries, and there was never any attempt to make the farming situation sustainable. The necessary inputs, of course, 2 to 5 tons per hectare of lime were never made. Cassava contract farming schemes have been put on some of these villages, and that's depleted soils. The panel of experts has signed off on this agricultural pillar only because the agency of French development, I'm not sure of the French pronunciation, AFD, the French Development Agency, has agreed to support sort of an agricultural livestock and fisheries project in the resettled areas for the next 5 years. However, in looking at that project, these issues of how are they going to deal with the soil quality is still not yet clear, and that's stated in the most recent panel of experts report. The livestock pillar, I'm going over time. Basically, the plan was there was, up to, I think, the survey in 1998 said there were 678 families with a total of 4,168 buffalo on the plateau. And the yearly trade in buffalo was around estimated to be $250,000 a year. So there was a high stocking of water buffalo up on the plateau. So the plan was to reduce that stocking before impoundment, and then basically maintain livestock as a business enterprise. So the reason why villages have livestock and buffalo is sort of like a bank. So they try to have a few buffalo, maybe rich families might, or well-to-do families might have 15 buffalo, so for some families had like 30 or 40. And then the idea was that when they needed cash, they were able to sell those buffalo. And our surveys in 2004, one buffalo would sell for around $300 to $400. And then they were able to get that necessary cash. So this has been the culture of the communities up there. The SDP looked at alternative forage production and stipulated a bunch of, unproven techniques to create forage, which was very much a different reality to what villages know. Villages typically release those water buffalo up into the forest areas, and that's how they graze. The result was that by failing to reduce the numbers of livestock before impoundment, there was mass starvation of these water buffalo, and a subsequent attempt to try and sell as many buffalo as possible just as the waters were coming in. And you'll see this picture at the top is Nakainua, the back of Nakainua, the same paddy fields that I've shown you before, as the waters were coming up in July. And you see the buffalo sort of feasting on the last remains of those paddy fields as the waters rose. This area is completely underwater now. But the selling of those buffalo immediately crashed the price of buffalo, and then a lot of buffalo just starved to death on the plateau or drowned. And some villages actually moved their buffalo into the WMPA, the protected area, which of course had all these detrimental effects on the forest situation there. Currently, the situation is that the number of buffalo have come right up again. There's no estimate, I think, of exactly how many, but it's estimated that it's overstocking land. The current situation is unsustainable. A recent Mekong Watch report from February this year quoted a man in Sokio said, I have 15 buffalo and they're not healthy because there's a lack of grass. And this is very much is in line with what the panel experts was saying. My time's sort of up, I've gone 5 minutes over. The off-farm thing, I just wanted to share with you, it's not something that's easy to monitor. It's about creating jobs and employment for people. But I wanted to share with you this idea about tourism, and tourism is really cited as an example of something that can be done with the Nakai Plateau. And when you look at the social development plan, the idea is like a Lake Geneva type of beautiful reservoir where people go yachting and sail on the wonderful lake. The reality is that because of the failure to conduct the biomass clearance, people that go up to the Nakai Plateau, and there are a lot of backpackers that go up there on this motorbike loop that goes around from Takek, Long Route 12, and then up on the Nakai Plateau, and then back down by Laos. And it's a real thing that backpackers do. I've done it myself. It's an enjoyable trip. But the reservoir is not the highlight of the trip. And I wanted to share with you these slides taken from the National Geographic website where people post their own photos of things. And, this gentleman, Rob Arnold, posted up some of his images of what he saw on his motorbike trip. And I just want to quote to you what he says. He says, seeing this large area of environmental destruction made me reflect on the environmental damage so-called green projects can sometimes cause. And I think this is the real problem that the entire reservoir has with tourism, is it's essentially a tree graveyard up there, and it's not the type of place that you want to go sailing aboard. What lessons to take? I think the facts speak for themselves. I just wanted to present Ted Scudder's remarks from the New York Times again. Of course, Bruce already presented this, but I think it really sums up the whole problem with trying to create these alternative livelihood scenarios. Here's a project that was so well studied, it was so in-depth, so detailed, all these technical bits. I can't imagine to think how much money is being spent on these resettlement programs and all the preparation work leading up to it, and it's just been a total failure. And I think, Ted Scudder's piece out of the New York Times really sums up very well what was wrong. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben, for sort of unpacking the 5 pillars promised in the resettlement program and show how the results actually different from the plan. So if you are interested in the book, it's available for sale outside for 900 baht, which I think is quite a good deal for a hardcover, and you can get signatures from the authors sitting here. After the session ends, please specify your interest to our officer outside. Right, next up we have Carl, who wrote chapter 13, Writing down Nam Turn 2 and its role in producing the discourse of sustainable hydropower. So I think it will be a critical look to how the Nam Turn 2 is being used by World Bank as well as constructing the discourse of sustainable hydropower and how it's actually possible, citing Nam Turn 2 as a good kind of example. So Carl here is an assistant professor and Faculty of Political Science, Chulalongkorn University, and also the director of Center for Social Development Studies, CSDS, based here in the Faculty of Political Science, Chulalongkorn University as well. His research interest centers around environmental justice and the political ecology of water and energy. So please come.
Okay, 13. So, as Sajjan Kasper said, the title of this chapter was Branding Dams, and I became particularly interested in how Dam Turn 2 is being reflected in these global policy discussions. So I think most of the book provides a lot of grounded evidence about what's happening around the project, the specific sites. But I think another important dimension to appreciate is how the idea of Dam Turn 2 has been conveyed both more broadly within Laos hydropower sector, beyond across Southeast Asia, and also globally. And so the chapter tries to explore not just the discourse, but how it happened and what the significance was. So few, if few of any hydropower projects have received such intense attention from the media, from civil society, researchers, and the hydropower industry as Namten 2. What I tried to do was to map out how the project is within policy discourses, how it became legitimized, and also how it revived the global hydropower industry since the 2000s, as Bruce mentioned. And in particular, I'm interested in how a discourse emerged of sustainable hydropower. So how do we see this concept of sustainability linking with the idea of building a hydropower dam? What I aimed to demonstrate was that Namten 2 was a pivotal moment for hydropower construction in Laos and globally. I think some of this is going to be sort of thinking through what Bruce said earlier, but to explain the wider context. So in the 1990s, the global hydropower industry, especially the hydropower industry from northern countries, was facing a growing crisis of legitimacy as they were increasingly criticized by opponents of the project that claimed the development benefits were exaggerated. This accumulated in the publication of the Multi-Stakeholder World Commission on Dams report in 2000, which affirmed many of these criticisms. In this context, the World Bank, seeking a means to re-enter hydropower construction, put forward Namten 2 as a new and better practice approach to hydropower. Meanwhile, the International Hydropower Association sought to counter the WCD with its own sustainability guidelines and subsequently a hydropower sustainability assessment protocol. From this significant and combined effort of the project supporters emerged a policy narrative of sustainable hydropower, which has sought to re-legitimize the industry but also reinvent hydropower as a sustainable development project rather than electricity infrastructure alone. So with large dams now high on government and business agendas in Southeast Asia, what I want to do is to discuss how this region has been a material testing ground of the concept of sustainable hydropower and central to the production of the sustainable hydropower discourse. And I think this gives particular salience given that the proponents of sustainable hydropower are also taking a leadership role in global level debates about the relationship between climate mitigation and hydropower and climate financing. So in other words, sustainable hydropower also links to access to new potential funds from the climate change mitigation mechanisms. Overall, I will argue that Namten 2 has become its own global brand in hydropower development and a symbol of the sector's revival. I will show how the World Bank and the Northern Hydropower industry regularly refer to Namten 2 as a way of legitimizing the possibility of sustainable hydropower existing. But I think, as the book also demonstrates, this is a fiercely disputed claim. To me, it seems that the industry is only mildly reforming rather than fundamentally transforming. And in many ways, Namten 2 stands as an anachronism amongst the new wave of hydropower industry that is now booming in Laos, with construction companies and financiers from countries like Thailand, China, and Vietnam that have largely adapted far weaker standards in terms of environmental and social accountability, as well as transparency, even as Namten 2 opened the possibility for these projects to proceed. So this is a little bit more academic, but the chapter tries to show how this has happened. So first I'll briefly introduce the concepts that I was using to understand sustainable hydropower discourse and the role that Namten 2 played. So a discourse is a shared set of concepts, categories, and ideas that provides its adherents with a framework for making sense of situations, embodying judgments, assumptions, and capabilities. So the production and reproduction of a discourse is a social process. It happens amongst people and institutions, and it reflects basically what the norms and rules will be about something that's happening. Francois Moll, who has done a lot of work in Southeast Asia, proposed the idea of nirvana concepts. So nirvana concepts are an ideal about what should happen. But as with everything about nirvana, it's very difficult to attain in practice. So he sees these concepts as underpinning discourses. So we have the ideal, and that shapes the narration of how something should be. So then the second idea is the idea of a narrative. So this is a simple story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. They often appeal to common sense, but in the process they often miss the complexity of reality. So in the problematization of Namten 2, the story often goes along the lines that Laos has an abundance of water resources, and it struggled to attract investment to reduce poverty. Dams can attract investment, by exploiting these resources and generate government revenues and implement programs of poverty reduction that Bruce was mentioning. And then the third concept is the idea of model. I mean, this is a word we may take for granted, but what do we actually mean by model? So a model actually, I understand it to be something that's based on particular instances of policy reform or development intervention, which entails some dimension of success. It's often approved by experts and powerful institutions. NAM10 is an archetypal model, according to this definition, and has been regularly referred to by the World Bank, as Bruce also mentioned, that this is a model hydropower project, it is claimed. So in this presentation, I'll explore what it means to talk about NAM10 as a model, both for Laos hydropower sector more broadly, and the sustainable hydropower concept as a Nirvana concept. So it's first worth noting that NAM10 has been heavily promoted by the World Bank as a model, to the extent that this book was published, Doing a Damn Better. According to the lead authors, the World Bank considered the objectives of NAM10 to be, quoting from the book, generate revenues through environmentally and socially sustainable development of NAM10's hydropower potential that will be used to finance priority poverty reduction and environmental management programs. And also from this book, it quotes, it aims to demonstrate that hydropower projects can be designed and implemented to deliver sustainable outcomes through state-of-the-art environmental and social practices and strengthen public financial management systems, but this takes time. And I think a lot of this book, Dead in the Water, evaluates and demonstrates the shortcomings of what the original promise was. But this book itself is also highly positioned. It does not seek to draw upon a wide array of literature, but rather explains the projects ultimately from the perspective of the bank. But I think it's a very interesting read that provides a number of lessons learned that are insightful. I think it does not demonstrate a project can be sustainable, just that clearly unsustainable projects can be improved upon. So I think this was already mentioned, the stakes for the World Bank in seeing through this project and putting it in a positive light reflected the high stakes at the time of the project approval, because it was the first project that the World Bank funded in over a decade. As Bruce mentioned, the evaluation shifted from moderately unsatisfactory in terms of these social and environmental programs in 2016 to moderately satisfactory in 2017. So what I want to sort of reflect on in this presentation is how the discourse around NAM10 emerged. So to promote NAM10 as a model, the World Bank invested heavily in communication. And it's very open about doing this. One of the most fascinating things I found about reading this book is how clearly the World Bank explains the strategy of communication to present the model project. So the lead authors of this book write from the beginning large hydropower. So the World Bank passed a water resources sector strategy in 2003 that spoke of high-risk, high-reward water infrastructure projects. And then subsequently had other policies, including a report titled Directions in Hydropower, and then Towards a Sustainable Energy Future for All in 2013. An article detailing World Bank's re-entry, published in 2013, writes, the World Bank has said its newest hydropower projects are larger and more complex than ever, part of a recent return to transformational projects. One transformational project is the NAM10 I think this is where we start to see the shift, like the reframing of what a hydropower project is. No longer is it a physical infrastructure project, but it's a transformational project for environmental, social, and political dimensions. And it's a development project more broadly defined, not just physical infrastructure. So to turn briefly how NAM10 was deployed as a narrative, as a development project, rather than as a dam in Laos. The Lao government placed hydropower central to its development strategy. It states that hydropower will enable them to transition from the least developed countries by generating dividends, royalties and taxes and attracting FDI into the country. On the Department of Energy Business website of the Ministry of Energy and Mines, it's written that NAM10 will be an outstanding example of how the government of Laos is working with the private sector and multilateral organizations to develop a sustainable development model. And you can see here. These sentiments were echoed more recently by the Laos Prime Minister, who reported, whose meeting with a World Bank official was reported. He said, "I think that in the future the government will refer to the success of Nam Son 2 as a good model." He added that there's a need to balance economic gain with environmental protection and rural community development that were important aspects of the project. And I think this is really important. We need to think about there are winners and losers in this project, but the losers need to be made more visible, and I think this is an important contribution of the book. Nam Son 2 was also a gateway to a hydropower boom in Laos, and I think this is quite significant because one of the expectations was that the lessons of Nam Son 2 would be carried forward to see better projects in the future. But actually, this is a quote from an interview by an academic in 2011 that kind of counters that position even within the government. So this is a quote from Mr. Virabong, the head of the Department of Electricity of the Ministry of Energy and Mines, who said, yes, they are saying that Nam Son 2 is a good project, but to use it as a standard, it's not possible. We can't use it as a good example, as a good light. We can use it as a good example, but not as a standard. All the developers say that it's not possible to use Nam Son 2 as a standard. So in other words, the original assumption that these lessons learned would be carried forward were even not reflected in the understanding of the government. But also interesting in this book, the World Country Director of the World Bank at the time also notes some concern about the future trajectory of Laos' hydropower sector. So he says, although developments are mostly positive, some disturbing elements are emerging amidst the flurry of activity. Currently, private sector developers, including some that may not be reputable hydropower companies, appear to be driving the agenda. So whilst he tries to put a optimistic frame on the future of the sector, there's a lot of evidence that that optimism is misplaced. And unfortunately, the tragedy that just happened a couple of months ago at ZPNC Nanoi, this was an article just yesterday in a Korean newspaper. I mean, I think there needs to be more discussion about this and what the findings were, but it suggests that the ZPNC Nanoi may have been partly due to cost-cutting measures of the company, leading to the collapse of the dam. But this is serious. Like this project led to the loss of life. In official numbers, the government have now reported in the Vientiane Times a couple of weeks ago that there are 131 people missing or confirmed dead. So the stakes are high, people's lives have been lost. It should lead to a very serious consideration about the future of the hydropower sector. So briefly then to frame, like what happened with Nam Son 2 beyond. So the World Bank Group sought to build a regional set of institutions around Nam Son 2's model status and to further the discourse of sustainable hydropower. So the IFC in particular have been active on this. The Hydropower Advisory Service was created in 2012, which its goal is to ensure hydropower development follows good international industry practices so that new projects are developed and operated in an environmentally and sustainable way. And I think the significance of this network in the context of sustainable hydropower is how did this idea spread? So one way has been that the IFC has established different working groups in Myanmar, in Nepal, in Pakistan, and maybe some people in this room may be even involved in these. But Nam Son 2 has been one of the ideas that has been shared across the different countries. So there's also a lot of interest in this book in countries like Myanmar about how one narrative of the project needs to be understood more broadly, not just the IFC's interpretation. But there are other ways that the project has been diffused to sustainable hydropower. So GIZ, for example, has a network of sustainable hydropower development in Mekong countries that works with universities. The Mekong River Commission has the Sustainable Hydropower Initiative. So I think in international development studies, we think words matter, they do matter. And so the idea that sustainable hydropower is now spreading across the region needs to be critically looked at. What is meant by sustainable hydropower? More broadly, this sort of Lao hydropower narrative and the sustainable hydropower concept is also in global level discussions. So for example, Nam Son 2 was presented at the World Water Week in 2014, the World Hydropower Congress in 2015, and a large conference, Hydro in Asia, was held in 2016 in Laos. So So in terms, like, is this a nirvana concept? Like, how optimistic can we be that these lessons learned, both positive and negative, are transferable? So Bruce mentioned about the World Commission on Dams. It's a significant report in the sense that it was a global assessment, a multi-stakeholder assessment, and you can see the summary here that dams have made an important and significant contribution to human development, but in too many cases an unacceptable and often unnecessary price has been paid to secure those benefits. It goes on to make a wide-ranging set of recommendations, but the hydropower industry in particular were less than enthusiastic about the World Commission on Dams recommendations, and so the industry response was to create the sustainability guidelines, so in other words, to recapture what sustainable hydropower meant rather than the WCD's understanding. So this website, for example, is run by the International Hydropower Association. It then also created an auditing tool called the Hydropower Sustainability Assessment Protocol, which is supposed to be a tool to evaluate at the different stages of project development how sustainable a project is. It included a number of big civil society groups, and in the process they visited Namtern too in 2010. And then the Hydropower Sustainability Assessment Protocol was launched in 2011 at the IHA Congress. My reading of this is that one reason why the industry has to recapture the concepts of sustainable hydropower is to secure its future role in the climate discussions. Now, we needless to say that sustainable hydropower as an idea presented by the IHA is also being heavily contested by civil society. So, for example, International Rivers has stated that the Hydropower Sustainability Assessment Protocol is a greenwash of the world dam industry. The protocol allows dam builders to claim that they are sustainable while they continue to violate international and national environmental and human rights laws. Tom Fulford also referred to this idea as the new mantra of dam builders. I think this is a genuinely serious question. How is it possible to do something that can be claimed as sustainable hydropower in the context of many of the ways that projects are being built in this region now? So, in conclusion, what I'm trying to do is to say, well, how is Namtern 2 being framed as a model project? And how does it fit into Laos' hydropower construction industry? And then how is it in turn trying to reframe hydropower projects from just being electricity projects to being development projects? The outcome has been that there's an imaginary of Namtern 2 that keeps on spreading as the concept of sustainable hydropower, and it's being framed well beyond the original context. So if it wasn't possible to do something like sustainable hydropower at Namtern 2, how can it be translated into other places where there's far less resources and effort involved in oversight? It can't be ignored that the hydropower industry is backed by a large and influential set of actors, but I think also the discourse of sustainable hydropower matters. Even in the case of Namtern 2, while some aspects were better than previous projects, problems still remain, as has been discussed on the panel. Yet the best practices of sustainable hydropower are reviving the hydropower industry, but I think it's not best practice, it's just business is a bit better, if at all. The final thought is that if we're going to see a sustainable energy transition in the region, it needs to move beyond just a discussion about sustainable hydropower. It needs to be about sustainable energy transition, and then that will help understand how hydropower does or does not fit into a sustainable energy future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carl. Next up, our last speaker, we have Associate Professor Dr. Panokwan Manorom, who helped co-wrote Chapter 8, Troubles, Downstream Changes in the Stable Prime River Basin. And she's going to be focusing on the gender invisibility at the Namtern 2 Dam. Ajahn Panokwan is a director of Nangkong Sub-Region Social Research Center for SSRC based at the Faculty of Liberal Arts, Ubon Ratchathani University, Thailand. So she's based in the northeastern part of Thailand. She's been working in Thailand and the region in fields such as political economy, resource governance, and development and impact assessment as well. and she had worked on the MECO Fellowship Project Underwater Land and Ecosystem Program on ULED Greater MECO during 2015 and 2007. So please, Susan.
Hello. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for waiting for me. Sorry, I'm being late because I just left my meeting this morning with Ajahn Suvichai Bankal on sustainable development. My part about gender, and I would like to share with you my experience working in the field. I don't have my own chapter in the book, but I share the chapter with Bruce and Ian. And okay, I will spend only 10 minutes talking about what I found in the field. And okay, before I talk about women and say Senongfai river basins and Namthon too, I would like to recall back to the Bangmun Dam. I did the research in the Bangmun Dam like many years ago until now, and I found that the mistake that we found and we face about the Bangmun Dam is now already repeated in the Senongfai area, which I think it shouldn't be like that. The World Bank should have learned a lot about the problems, the impacts of the Bangmun Dam, and should make a better dam, as they say, actually on the ground. When we went to the Senongfai River basin after the Namthon 2 being built and released water in the area, we found that the impact just similar to what I saw in the Bangmun Dam have seen over the past 30 years. So I just feel a bit upset and feel that the better dam will be happening. That's based on my experience. This is the Bangmun Dam, and still people still protested over the dam in order to ask the government to open the gates for them at least 4 months a year. But the government just try not to do that 4 months a year, maybe 3 months a year or 2.5 months a year, not according to the order of the Thaksin government at all. The Thaksin government asked IGAT, the owner of the Bangmun Dam, to open the gates at least 4 months a year, but actually not, because of the powerful IGAT and electricity generating power. And before I went to the area, Bruce and Ian and Monsali did the baseline data. They came up with the book, People and Their River, and the book came out in 2001. That's very interesting book as a baseline data about the life of the women and the life of the people who mostly depend on the resources along the Senongfai River in terms of food security, in terms of income, and also a lot of ethnic minorities located along the rivers in the tributary of the Namthon River as well. At least up to 150 communities, and most of them ethnic minority, but the government seem to ignore, seem to overlook who the people located or use the resource over there. So when we went to the field in 2014, and my part, I was responsible for collecting data from women. I interviewed more than 30 women, and also we had a chance to talk with ethnic minority, or we call indigenous people. We went to many villages of the indigenous people, and we found that a lot of problems over there. I think Bruce said briefly, and also Carl said about that already. And I would like to focus on the life of the women. I would like to give a few examples about the women who I interviewed. The first one, the livelihood of these women. She got many family members. Most of her farmland flooded by the dam, and main livelihoods of hers like fishing and collecting aquatic resources in the tributary and in the wetland nearby the dam. But nowadays it's very hard for her to get access to aquatic resources because of the level of the water is very high. making her difficult to get access to the collecting, aquatic collecting sites, and very difficult for her to get income. And most of her family, most of her farmland flooded, so she doesn't have enough rice to eat all year round. So it's very difficult for her, even if she tried to survive by looking for fishing resources, but gone. The government gave her like two hybrid chickens, and she sold 2 of them in order to get money to buy rice. This is about daily suffering. And this is the river before the dams release the water to the Ceylon Fire. This the photo taken by our friend Bill Robichaud, the editor of the book. The people worship the water before all flooded. This is the last day of the natural flow of the Ceylon Fire river. It's very difficult totally different from what we saw in 2013 or 14. And okay, here's the environment or the geographical or the physical setting that we found. We went to the wetland area, the Hoi Kama, the tributary of the Ceylon Fire. This is what we found. It's very difficult for people. It's very hard for people to get access to fishing resources or aquatic resources. You can see it clearly from this. And the second case about this woman, she had to move her house 3 times. She couldn't be able to know how far she should go, what the safer place for her to build another house after the waters came to the village. So at that time she lost her husband and she lost another one. So it seemed to me that every day is suffering. So she suffered a lot, not because of the dam, plus psychological problem of losing her husband, who lost after the water came, and also after her second house resettled. And the third case about the Blue woman, we went to the Blue village, and the homeless been forced to relocate on the higher ground area, but the government did not provide anything. The company, the Berlala company who grow rubber tree, aside or found the place for these people to be relocated. The government did not give them anything, housing materials or facilities. They lost all of their farmland and also the fishing resource, because it's very difficult for them to get back to the village. Even it's not so far, about 1 kilometer far from the original place, but it's very difficult because the scarcity of fish resources and other aquatic resources because of the flooding came to the area. This is the last examples about dry season rice. And many farmers lost their land. They tried to grow rice, but very difficult. The government tried to supply irrigation water as promised, but the problem is that the cost of the investment for dry season rice is very high. They've been complaining. Normally, wet season rice, for the wet season rice, they do not have to pay any cost. They use organics manure, they use rainwater, but now they have to spend money on inputs, they have to spend money on pesticide because of pesticide, and also has to spend money on electricity to pump water. So she complained that why don't I have to pay for dry season rice? And the last case about this woman, she also, I think she's blue, and her house just right next to the river after the Namthon came to the area and flooded the areas. The bank of the river is very steep and she also lost her fishing ground. She could not be able to use very simple tools like scoop nets or use her hand to get access to catch fish. And the banks very steep that making her very difficult to climb up the bank of the river and fresh water from the river to use in her house. That's very tough life. So the key message I found from my gender perspective research, number one, I think the Nocturne to Dams marginalized people and ethnic minority. Even though the World Bank, they come up, they have the guideline for ethnic minority and gender, but in the implementation level, it's very rare that we found that this kind of guideline would be implemented effectively in the area. And they even did not try to study comprehensively who are they in the area, particularly ethnic minority, the blue people. And the livelihood of the people over there is mostly lost. They try to find another livelihood strategies. They send their kids to Bangkok or send their children to do another farm, to do farming or rice farming with their kinships or kins or people who they related in another area in order to get rice to eat all year round. Every day they've been suffering and emotional. They talk to me in big tears and some of them crying. And they said, I couldn't be able to complain because I'm afraid that the village chief would come and police would come and arrest me. This is the words that they talk to me and they tell me what's going on in the area. And the World Bank and the company paid less attention on the people living in downstream area. The tracking chain system on compensation is not very effective, and the World Bank also admitted that they don't have enough system to monitor whether or not the tracking chain systems work very well. So they don't have put any mechanism strongly enough to track the system that about the compensation in the area. This is in general terms, so it's not just in the area. So I would like to stop and for further discussion. Thank you.
Indeed, the most vulnerable tended to suffer the most. So we have around 25 minutes for questions, discussions, comments. You can direct your question to any of the speaker here. And please state your name and affiliation.
Yes, my name is Nawal Kamal. I have no affiliation. It is heartbreaking almost to hear from you, and I think the book demonstrates it very forcefully, that the dam business, at least as developed by the World Bank and supported by IGAD and others who stand to benefit from it, is a human tragedy, an environmental disaster, and probably a sheer economic failure when it comes to the country that hosts. So my question to the panel is that you've demonstrated from the World Bank perspective that this is a failure, and the danger is that the bank recuperates this project and makes it into a model and multiply its implementation probably in Myanmar next, if not in Laos and other places. So my question to the panel is that, so what is the action, or what is the perspective that you will be taking next with the World Bank? There are lots of NGOs that critique the World Bank, and there are international fora how do you make sure, or how do we put the World Bank in front of its responsibilities, accountability? This is very important, not only for the project, but for what it might, the damage that it might do next. So that's the first question. And the second question picks up what Carl said at the end. And what he suggested is that the debate should go beyond just hydropower, should get into electricity, should get into sustainable energy development. And I would like again to put the question to the panel, because I would like to know whether there's any thinking on that, or whether you and your networks have already started such a debate. I might come back on this point, because I have been myself doing work on this, and I can share with you, but I would like first to hear from the panel. Thank you.
Well, on the first part, very much this whole book project, I think, is an attempt to try to look at this, and I remember being in Myanmar, I guess 4 years ago, after doing the Save-On-5 project, and realizing that the World Bank's IFC was starting to come to Myanmar to promote hydropower there and start doing options assessments, and they're very much talking about their positive experience from Laos. And then I remember also meeting people that had gone on study tours that the World Bank had sponsored to Nam Tin Tu from, they were bringing people from Nepal and Vietnam and all over to come look at what a positive example it was. And that wasn't very much kind of the motivation for wanting to document what had really happened with the project, because I mean I had seen personally how in the downstream areas that the reality was very different from what was being promoted. I talked to my colleague Bill Robichaud about the conservation outcomes and how disappointing they were, and then Glenn and other people had been following things on the Gai Plateau, and all of a sudden we're just like, well, wait, this is like all the main issues that was supposed to make this a better project. We really need to document this to try to get a different story out there. It's actually to date been rather disappointing that the World Bank has not been willing to engage with us to discuss this. Kanakwan and I just both presented at the Civil Society Policy Forum of the World Bank's annual meeting in Bali last week, and we had a 3-person session we proposed, and months ago we invited the World Bank staff to participate, because the whole point of these sessions are to have the bank engage with people that have concerns, and they stalled out on giving us any response, and then finally just a couple weeks before the forum said that they weren't going to provide a staff person to attend or to participate in their session. And then even though it was inside the World Bank meeting, none of their staff came to our presentation. And it's such a contrast with what Carl was describing, the amount of public relations, and up until a couple of years ago, the bank was just, any criticism of the project, they would immediately have a press release and be coming out with a statement. And they're still doing statements, or kind of statements through the Lao government, or most recently, just last week, the French Development Agency, which is taking over the resettlement work on the Gai Plateau, to put out an online article which is just called Nam Tin Tu, an exemplary project, which just kind of repeats all of the same idea that it's just an excellent new model of project and doesn't acknowledge any of the concerns that we know that they're aware of. And so I don't know, it seems like there's so much of the reputation of the bank got caught up in this project that it's really, really hard for them to admit that it hasn't worked out the way it was supposed to. And I don't know, other than just forums like this and trying to get the word out as best as we can. We're trying to work with civil society groups specifically in Myanmar, and are going to have some presentations there in a couple weeks with groups there and in some other neighboring countries to try to spread the word. And I'm hoping we can get the bank to engage with us at some point. And I would much rather have them here in this room and be debating with us a little bit, but so far it's they have not seemed too interested in that. I'll leave, maybe Carl, do you want to take the second part?
Maybe just one brief comment on the first. I think the challenge, like the biggest challenge is, I think, the shrinking role of the World Bank anyway. So I totally agree with Bruce that, and the mapping that I gave of how the IFC is diffusing the concept of sustainable hydropower, and that does matter because it's creating a public discourse. But if you look beneath the surface about what types of developers are actually building most of the projects in Southeast Asia, they're not really ascribing to these norms and even very strongly to the concept of sustainable hydropower, and I think that's important. So, I don't think that means that the World Bank does not have a role, but actually it's a broader set of challenges. So, for example, now there's the Lanchang Mekong Cooperation Framework, which is China's strong involvement into Southeast Asia. There's the role of ASEAN. There's the ADB-GMS, but a lot of these earlier framings of regional economic integration are actually continuing, but now are far more strongly sector-led, mainly with financiers and project developers from within the region. And as I said, with far less accountability, transparency, closed media space. So I think that these forums are important, but a wider set of different types of research done by different research groups, as well as different types of public forums with civil society, with academics across the region. Not just talking to the World Bank. I think it shouldn't just be that, it's the wider set of actors and the trajectory. And I think it leads actually very importantly to what your second question is, which is how do we see energy transition happening? When I started looking at the sort of political economy of energy, you can see that there's some very influential actors that generate most of the electricity and therefore shape most of the decision making. They're both the state utilities, they're the other state agencies that are kind of mainly prioritizing economic growth as their mandate. It's their mandate to do that. And then the sort of turn from state-led projects to private sector projects now. So I think until recently it was relatively unchallenged that business as normal meant building these large dams, coal-fired power stations, and gas, which is a very important source in Thailand. Where do I see the potential for change? Well, I think the most recent power development plan of Thailand was stated as being necessary. So the recent process to reevaluate Thailand's power development plan was stated as necessary due to disruptive technology. Now, there's been for several years now a stronger and stronger argument that renewables can be economically viable as a larger component of the energy mix. But I think the reason in many other regions, the energy transition is happening far more quickly than Southeast Asia. But I think now the economics is becoming increasingly difficult to deny. But I think also just new technology, there's a very interesting example of blockchain technology enabling new models of electricity generation that actually doesn't need the state utility. It's direct trading of electricity between producer and consumer. And so the Energy Regulatory Commission of Thailand is having to think about the new rules, and they're actually putting in place a new tax so that EGAT can compete more equally with this new technology. But I think also things like battery technologies, the solar, this is an opportunity, I think. Technology is an entry point, but I think what we also need to really appreciate is that energy is about public good. It's not just a technology problem, and it's not just an economic issue. It links into lots of other publicly important considerations, environmental and social. So I think although it's technology is one part. There needs to be forums discussing this transition. One brief comment on this. Thailand, until recently, did actually have far more engagement, public engagement with the power development plan. I think this time around it's been less so. But maybe, like, that's the space, the official power development plan.
I would like to focus on gender and indigenous people. I think the government or the World Bank may be working very hard in Myanmar. I think in Laos, mostly companies from Thai, they played a role in building the dam. But now World Bank played a role in Myanmar. I think from my experience at the bank, even the company who work with the bank to build the dam, they should acknowledge the existence of the indigenous people. In Myanmar, for example, a lot of indigenous communities. So it is very key point because based on the experience in Laos, even the Lao government they acknowledge indigenous people, even though they seem to ignore some ethnic minorities. They acknowledge some, most of them, but not all of them being acknowledged by the Lao government. For example, the Guru community, that their life mostly destroyed by the dam. So I think this is a great lesson learned. So the effectiveness of the World Bank mechanism is that try to use their guideline because they got the guideline on ethnic minority, on ethnicity and gender. They should be implementing it effectively or under the concept inclusiveness. So no one left behind. So I hate the word, but I have to say no one should be left behind. I don't know. There's a UN word.
I might just say something about Myanmar because I've been working there for the past 4.5 years on land issues. And before that I was in Laos for 10 years. Myanmar is a very different place to Laos and it's particularly inspiring to work there. Primarily because the civil society is so engaged and so switched on. And I don't really see like what's happened in Laos and is continuing to happen in Laos replicating, to a large extent in Myanmar, just because I just don't think it's possible. There's a lot of ethnic armed groups, of course, that control territory. Mind you, one of those ethnic armed groups is actually supporting a hydropower dam on its own territory. But I just think that civil society is so engaged on these issues and very much concerned. It's going to be great to have Bruce come over to Myanmar, and the last time he came over, we had a very small little half-day workshop and packed, like 80 to 100 people all there, just because there's not a lot of information on what's been going on in the region around hydropower issues, and people are very, very, very concerned in Myanmar. And so yes, things are moving forward. I understand the IMC is considering supporting some hydropower dams. I don't need them, but there's certainly those sorts of things in play. But I think it's going to be much more difficult, especially there's elections in 2 years' time, and I think people are just very, very concerned. And indigenous rights movements are much stronger in Myanmar.
Another round of question. I think
Yeah, Pichai, independent development specialist. Thank you very much. I think it's quite enlightening, sort of exercise that this panelists have tried to portray. I'm not trying to defend the World Bank, but I happen to know the World Bank director here who was one of the co-authors. So when this book came out, I immediately shared with him. Of course, he probably has read it now. Unfortunately, he's not around. In fact, I asked him whether he's around and whether he could come and join. But in my previous discussion with him, I asked him, would you be happy to come and join the forum, just to debate on this? I mean, to be fair, and to be, for me, to be a devil's advocate, I was saying, to be fair on both sides. I'm sure they have their story to tell too. I think he was quite open and said, I'll be willing to do so. So maybe give it another try. CSCS can convene another forum, follow up, and then invite him to come. But having said that, and looking at the issues and so forth, and also like what Carl was saying and others about replicating these kind of schemes in the rest of Southeast Asia, for example. Then brings me to the question, for example, like in the case of Laos, where we know that where the governance system is relatively weak, right? So even in the best conditions, with the best intentions, I just wonder whether you can have a sustainable hydropower development in Laos. Just looking at the other examples of other projects, of dam projects, and not just the World Bank one, like the Thai, the Xayaburi Dam or the Don Sahong Dam, and then the Chinese ones that are building, and not to mention the ones on the tributaries like Nam U Dam, Cascade, which is being already in place. I remember I saw a Thai PBS who actually went there and filmed the Nam U Cascade and interviewing some of the villages there. And there's probably even worse. The reservoirs, they don't even clear the reservoir, and then it becomes very putrid, and so the villagers are already complaining, the fisheries are dying, the livelihoods. So, relatively speaking, you have to then look at across the board, how can you have a more standardized norm across, And of course, then ultimately we have to talk to the Lao government to see whether they will buy this kind of argument, right? So maybe I would challenge the panelists to go for dead in water too, and then try to assess the other dams also, not just the World Bank one, just to be fair and to be more comprehensive, and see how that is being done. Of course, I agree, like what Glenn was saying, maybe Myanmar is slightly different, maybe because, again, maybe it reflects the governance systems, right? Right now it's a little bit more open, more democratic, so civil society is stronger, which is not the case in Laos, right? So, but then Laos wants to be a battery of Southeast Asia, so the only thing that comes in mind is hydro, right? Even though attempts have been made to have other, renewables as well. But then, now, for example, yesterday or the day before, there was news that an Oxford University study said that the whole power generation system, like that, what Carl was saying, it's not going to match up with the climate, emission standards. They did a comparative to say how much coal is actually going to be pumping more coal power plants in Southeast Asia over the next foreseeable future, and then how you're going to offset with whatever you pledge at the Paris climate. So then what is the alternative? Is hydropower a better alternative in terms of climate? Although hydropower also emits emissions, but relatively speaking. So I think I agree that there needs to be a more intersectoral and nexus kind of discussion. The energy ministers have to talk to the environment ministers or the social welfare ministers or whatever, Right now it's all in silos, and that's how, government systems and by and large are structured. So you have to then cut across, basically. But of course, I'm trying to promote ASEAN to do a little bit more of that, and we'll see how far that goes. So basically more nexus cross-sectoral, and also looking at more broadly, like say, on governance systems. How can you then encourage more better accountability, responsive, inclusive dealing of the real? Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. Robert Kinnear, Alternative Innovations. I do conceptual design. Bruce knows me already from last night and has heard most of this before. I was delighted to hear Carl's mention of blockchain. Finally, I've found somebody in the wilderness who understands what I'm about to say. I'm an engineer, I'm a civil engineer, I'm a water engineer. One thing before I go into the main point is I would that Nam Noon was actually the first dam on a tributary in Laos and opened in 1971. So this, they actually had, as I'm quite sure you guys are aware, they had a lot of problems with that too. In 1989, I had a little personal project that the interim Mekong Committee assisted my entry into Laos to look at a few things, and that's when I saw this problem. So this is not the first dam, and I don't know why they went ahead with it, calling it the first one, when they've had so many problems for 40 years already, 50 years. Anyway, my main point here is to introduce the concept of a design I came up with in 2011 at the time of the flooding here in Thailand. It has since developed into a mini hydropower system running parallel with the flood prevention. I call it the river catchment flood prevention system in parallel with this hydropower system. It's sort of reverse engineering, which Carl seemed to indicate. Right now, big dams store a lot of water and distribute electricity to small outlets. However, if you turn that around and make small reservoirs, which are not dams, a dam may be a reservoir, but a reservoir is not a dam. The reservoir is offset from the river course, thereby storing water and therefore has the power, the potential of making hydropower, but in a small scale. This is being done all over the world. You will see it in Nepal, even here in Thailand. People are doing it up in Chiang Mai and around. People are doing this in many things, self-financing, people-created guys. It's just needing the political awareness and financial assistance to join the dots to make this a people's movement instead of, like I said, I felt I've been running around in the wilderness here. But the point being is that by having all these small retention reservoirs, they're not all the problems that have been discussed here this morning disappear. 90-95% of the problems disappear because you're not blocking the dam course, the river course. You're not disrupting the life of riverside people or the flora or the fauna or the fishing or anything. What you're doing is creating small retention reservoirs and then taking the power from that and sending it back to the main power station where it can be further redistributed. The thing that's beneficial about this is it not just does away with all the problems that have been highlighted here this morning, but it allows each of these areas which are developing these small hydro systems, allows them to develop, because roads infrastructure has to go in, the actual retention reservoirs to be created, the power system, the maintenance, the control of it all. All this creates development and will encourage people to stay because it improves the quality of life by providing a sustainable water supply, electricity supply, and employment, and all the benefits of city living in the countryside in a rural environment. And completely does away with all the problems that there's no CO2 emissions effectively, it's all sustainable. And how I've been trying to do this for 7 years, and I just can't believe that despite a great deal of effort, I'm a one-man band, so I need some assistance here. I can't take on the world myself. I try, but it's a tough job. What I can say, in this university here, I spoke to, I can't remember his surname, my apologies, but Professor Charit, about 5 years ago. He invited me to I thought it was another one of those big forums. It turned out it was in a coffee shop with 12 people, including AFD. And this was the time of, maybe it was more than 5 years ago, it was when Yingluck was the Prime Minister, and her personal the secretary was there taking notes. He was trying to take my project and introduce it into the Chula engineering curriculum, needing finance from the ADB, who remarkably abstained from the meeting and donating any money towards it. So I could go on endlessly about various attempts. I'll say one more, and that is in Nepal. I met with Practical Action, who since 1979 have been doing hydro schemes, and they were very interested in my scheme. I'd already met with the Assistant Finance Minister of Nepal, who's probably changed by now, I suspect, but he was very interested in helping finance this along with Practical Action to do a pilot. Unfortunately, my time ran out, and of course, as far as I know, nothing's happened. But there is, if anybody can grab hold of the concept I'm giving, I've been doing this I'm an engineer of 48 years experience. I've been a general manager of an international engineering company. This is a real thing. It's an engineering solution to the problem which is being created by engineers. This is an alternative means of fixing the problem, and it's real. I'm a highly practical, intelligent civil engineer, water engineer, and I'd love for somebody to give me assistance and get this thing moving. Thank you for your time.
Maybe I'll just quick response to that. Thank you. I mean, it sounds like a promising technology. I think that, last night when we had the panel at the Foreign Correspondents' Club, a reporter asked, what did our panel think about what would be, are there any more sustainable hydropower projects we could see supporting in Laos? And I think that in terms of Laos, it comes down to who makes decisions. And there's a lot of money being made on large hydropower projects right now through the whole planning and construction, getting the concessions, and you see the huge amount of resources in Vientiane now compared to other parts of the country, and where the money is going out of those projects. And it's going to come. Fundamentally, it's about how are people in Laos going to make decisions on their development course. And right now, it's a very top-down situation, and so you've got a lot of money being made by certain parties there, and so that makes it challenging, I think, for anybody to advocate or have a serious consideration of any types of alternatives, even though they might well be in the best interest of the majority of people in the country. It's still challenging to get some of that consideration of all sorts of alternatives in development policy. So that would just be one response to that for Laos in particular. Toshi, sorry, I was kind of interrupted.
No, that's all right. My question is a bit more social scientific and specifically about Carl's presentation on narratives, because I'm also studying and interested in the power of narratives, but I'm trying to look at narratives more sort of positively, and in my framework of analysis, if you have narratives can also lead to alternative narratives or maybe counter narratives. And if we have a framework of analysis like that, I'm just wondering if, Carl, you also looked into alternative narratives and then counter narratives that can try to challenge the World Bank narrative on Namdun 2 or the hydropower sector in general. And I asked that question a bit more specifically because while the World Bank and the Durban proponent side try to revive the entire hydropower sector and the Namdun 2 in particular, us coming from, oh, by the way, my name is Toshi and I'm working for Mekong Lodge, and one of the NGOs got heavily involved in the Namdun 2 campaign. and still trying to look at monitor the consequences of the project. Anyway, so we run the public campaign, and eventually a campaign was not successful in the sense that the World Bank, approved, along with other financial institutions like ADB, decided to approve the project. In other words, their narrative won, and our narrative or narratives did not win. And when I try to reflect upon our campaign, based on your presentation, especially about narratives, that seemed to lead me into a bunch of questions like, where are our narratives? Where were our narratives? And if we had our own narrative or narratives in plural, how come our narrative did not win? How come our narratives did not have enough power to counter the World Bank narrative effectively? Perhaps we didn't take discourse more seriously, perhaps too much boggled down with sort of scientific details and technical details. Perhaps we should take other strategies more seriously. What are lessons we can learn for now and also future campaigns in order for us to be able to counter like the discourse battle that the other side is trying to challenge us with, because I guess right now, not just the World Bank and other IFIs, but perhaps the private sector is also trying to carry out very similar or even the same kind of public relation strategy, and we have to, in order for us to continue to fight our own battle, we have to counter that, or we have to come up with alternatives so that we can work more effectively. So that's basically my question.
Two questions for Carl. I think afterwards, the rest of the panel can try to address the issues together if they still has a final remark. Due to time constraints.
Thank you. A fantastic question. So this is actually an opportunity for an advertisement, because we have also been thinking very much about this issue more broadly in the context of Southeast Asia and environmental politics or resource politics in general, and we plan to organize a public forum on the 16th of November here. And the public forum will be exploring the spaces for narratives and counter-narratives around resource issues. I could talk at length, I'm not going to, but I think actually the issues that you've just put onto the table are very, very important in terms of the future of a possible sustainable development in Southeast Asia. And I think I'd also then directly related to this gentleman's intervention as well, also as a civil engineer by training originally, but now in political science. Because wanting to understand two sides of this, one is the engineer's dream, and then the reality of what those engineering dreams translate to in terms of practice on the ground. And it leads to the need for engineers to be far more humble in terms of mega projects and think about other alternatives like this. Okay, so narratives and counter-narratives. I think, dominant discourses and counter-discourses. I think one of the most fascinating reads in the World Bank book is the rendering visible of the important play to the downplaying of the counter-narrative against the project. So this is going back to words matter. Like, legitimacy comes from the perception of the project. So I would actually say the remarkable work of civil society, given the asymmetries of resources, the World Bank had a lot more resources to put into the framing publicly. Organizations like Mekong Watch, International Rivers and others have less people, less resources, and did successfully create the need for counter-narratives. So I would see counter-narratives in two ways. Number one is the one that you are framing, that there's a dominant narrative that legitimizes what's happening. And I think one counter-narrative is to pick apart the claims of that dominant narrative. The second, I think, is to be able to put forward alternatives, which is difficult because with so few resources, but they do exist, and this has been emphasized already. I think, so one comment on this then is the need for public space. Like public sphere, there's the need for physical meetings like this, there's the need for the ability to be heard in mass media to influence a wider public agenda, and then I think also nowadays increasingly it's about social media. Maybe not so influential at the time of Amsterdam too, but now very important in, like, in the way that discussions are had. I think a lot of a lot of the work of a dominant narrative is to make invisible the other one. So it's not just about putting forward what the dominant narrative should be, but a lot of effort is played into making other people's opinions invisible, either delegitimizing them or just not giving them the space to talk. And so that is a part of the work of why sometimes a counter position is not heard. I think then, but actually I see some interesting opportunities going back to energy planning now. Other work I've done is ask questions of how might electricity transition occur in Thailand, and what's the role of civil society? And I would say that the mainstream is maintained by a sort of political economy that benefits certain industries and state actors the most, and some banks. But they're now under pressure on two sides. One is the global narrative, especially around climate change, that means that business as usual cannot continue if Thailand's performance in the eyes of the international community about climate change is to be acknowledged as doing okay. So there's pressure from above. But also I think the inevitability of these alternatives, like maybe, I'm not so familiar with this project, but more broadly like solar power, wind, it's not saying this is not a viable idea, but I think the shift towards decentralized technologies is becoming far more possible. And so you have a dynamic of pressure from above and possibilities from below, putting pressure on the mainstream. So I think the transition can happen over time from those dual pressures. It doesn't mean that the mainstream does not resist, but I think that the mainstream is finding new spaces. Maybe they're thinking now, solar, it doesn't just have to be small, massive solar farms as well. And that's maybe their space, but it brings up other issues like land and water issues like the Nexus stuff. But I would just sort of say that those dynamics of which narrative is a key part, I think, are always changing and maybe changing right now. So maybe I'll just stop there. And if you want to have some response.
I'm very sorry, very quickly. The narrative is extremely important to influence the political systems within the countries. If there is some democracy, the narrative will have an impact. If there's no democracy, it will die. But believe me, when you come to the World Bank, and I have to disclose that I was a director at the World Bank for 15 years, so I'm an ex-director of the World Bank. The narrative will always be fought by a counter-narrative. And when the heat is up, they will just not show up. So you are very naive if you think you could counter the World Bank by narrative. The only way to do it is simple. Follow the money. The World Bank is interested in dams because the World Bank lends money to love. Lends, does not give. So that the World Bank, as a bank, gets the profit from all the projects that it performs. They have a discourse. Of course, it's a brilliant narrative. Do they implement it? This is the question. We have to hold them accountable. We have to go to the bottom line, which is their portfolio. The $1.5 billion of profits that they make from the project per year is the bottom line. And I can tell you the story about how you get to this, but that's another conversation.
We can invite you back on the 16th in the background.
I just also wanted to share something. When I was in 2004, 2005 in Laos, I was very much involved in a lot of discussions with a whole range of different people around whether the ADB and the World Bank were going to say yes to this project. And if my memory serves me correct, I don't really follow these issues, so maybe somebody knows a bit better than I, but I think in the case of the Asian Development Bank, there is a system in place where the different country officers say yes or no. And I remember that we had a visit from representatives of the U.S. government, including Treasury and State, and they actually came to meet with the NGO I was working for. And Bruce, I don't know if you can talk about this, but my understanding was there were mechanisms inside the U.S. government where civil society sort of forced an investigation to happen before that decision was made around whether the U.S. would say yes or no to the project. And you know, I was really impressed to see people come out and actively talk to us, talk to other stakeholders on the ground to try and get a good understanding of the situation in Laos at the time. As I understand, the Americans ended up abstaining on that vote. I don't think they supported the project, and I think you know these sorts of IFIs and these multilateral institutions, they need some sort of accountability in their own country offices as well. And I think that mechanism that the U.S. Civil society groups use to sort of challenge that yes or no process, I think in that case was very effective. We didn't get to meet with any other representatives from any other country office anywhere in the world, and yet you know by pure force of Treasury and State trying to understand and comprehend the situation on the ground, they ended up not saying no, but at least abstaining from the program.
I think they actually did say no. This is my recollection that the U.S. did vote no, but it was kind of a soft no, because when the U.S. really wants to be against something, they'll do some heavy lobbying of other countries to also vote no. In this case, it was a little more symbolic, but it certainly was a response to the engagement they've had with civil society groups. Both, I think there were some individuals involved in that, and Treasury that came to Laos that weren't particularly committed, but there was also a lot of advocacy work done by groups in Washington D.C. and other U.S. groups. You know, at that time there was also an Australian government review that included some academics and development people to try to define an Australian government position. And I don't know who they listened to, but they actually came out with a report I think it was in March 2005, just a few weeks before the vote, and it strongly endorsed Dumpton based on their review. And that, I know that had a big impact on getting some of the other bilateral donors on board, because the World Bank, they definitely did not want to do it alone, and they'd come up with a decision framework a couple years beforehand, which said that they would have to have broad support from other donors and from civil society, interestingly. And they, in the end, kind of had to abandon the part about civil society, because there was I think, was it Mekong Watch or Friends of the Earth Japan did a letter, with over 150 civil society groups opposing the project that went to the EDs shortly before approval, and really the banks, they kept coming back to the NGOs that had endorsed or gotten involved in the project, which was really just 3 NGOs, which all had contracts with the project. And the bank kept coming back and saying this shows we have civil society support. And one of our chapters in the book goes into those dynamics a lot. It's pretty interesting because they created huge conflicts in the NGO community back then. But there definitely was a very strong civil society campaign in that 2004 and early 2005, and it just the project just had so much momentum that the civil society groups were just not. And I think part it was the bank was able to split the conservation community at the time, and that was probably somewhat the more reasonable conservation groups. So united we fall. United we stand, divided we fall sometimes. You know, that was part of it.
I really like your question, but I still have to respond to that. I've been working with civil society in China and not in other countries, but overall I think there's a shrinking space of civil society these days, in Thailand particularly, within the political context this time. So this is one major challenging things for the civil society. Why not? They win. Because the space of them is like shrinking and smaller. And the government tried to come up with the concept PPP, private public partnerships, rather than focusing on having space more for civil society to express their right or their demand or something like that. I think this is a big challenge for everyone in the Mekong region. So how are we going to do that? I think it's very difficult within the political context, but I think, as Carl said, we need more help from middle class. I don't know why middle class so quiet. It's very challenging. Why the middle class in town, even the student in the university, they do not care about what's going on the ground. Even in Thailand, this is very maybe more individualistic, maybe more capitalizing. I don't know. It's very difficult. It's a trendy in the Mekong region. So it is a big issue for us to explore, to discuss. Why the middle class, they seem to overlook or not feel attached to what's going on in the society. I don't know, that's my feeling. I'm quite sad too. I don't know.
Didn't the Sapien Saint Noi disaster, it seemed like that had a huge amount of attention in the Thai media and maybe concern from Thai people. And I think sometimes it's the very dramatic disaster is a lot easier to focus on when there's a huge humanitarian disaster rather than kind of the slow unrolling disaster that actually is taking place with a lot of these projects, but that's very invisible compared to the very acute disaster we saw with Sapien Saint Noi.
Well, because of the time, the session has to end here, but you're welcome to take the questions outside, talk to our speakers, because I think they'll stay here for a bit. And so thank you very much, our panelists, and thank you for the contribution from the floor as well. So I think those two, a lot of presentations have been focusing on the World Bank and how the hydropower, the international organization can behave ecologically and try to justify that. But a number of chapters in the book also address cases in Laos government and Thailand. So I think the states that wanted to exchange economic prosperity for massive environmental degradation, that biofuels need to be under scrutiny as well. But those two exist under kind of a symmetrical power structure where we tend to believe this big international organization not just because they're the money source, just like the kind of power in itself, but because the organization controls I think information and knowledge and expertise, where that's the kind of power. And so the Live the Dream project, I think, can turn into a nightmare without any adequate assessment. So thank you very much all for coming to the book launch today, and maybe buy the book outside. Right, thank you very much.
Yes, I'm kind of waiting for Bill to get back to me. Is that where that is? I got that email. I don't really know.